Hey, welcome to the Dana Campfire Circle. We're gonna get things started. We got quite a large crowd already, so this is awesome. We're gonna get to participate in a tradition that really will echo off these domes and these pines here. First, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jack. I'm a naturalist ranger up here in Tuolumne Meadows, part of Yosemite National Park. This is my 7th season working here in the park. So yeah, one of the great traditions here in the Dana Campfire Circle, maybe you participated in it, is the campfire yell. So all we have to do is yell at the top of our lungs. So I count down 3, 2, 1. We'll yell campfire. And we'll probably do it 2 times. So just to make sure everyone in the campground really knows what's going on tonight. So we'll do our first one. Let's direct our voices in that way towards our friends way down in Lee Vining. Let's see if they can hear us. All right. So I'll count down 3, 2, 1, and then campfire. Ready? Hear your voices. 3, 2, 1. Campfire! Hey, that was pretty good. We got more people now, so let's do another one. Let's direct it towards Yosemite Valley, like way over there. Maybe they'll hear us down there. All right, 3, 2, 1. Campfire! Wow, it worked. So here we are in Tuolumne Meadows, part of the subalpine of this national park, Yosemite. I just want to briefly mention a few things about this park, and then we'll let the presenters come up. We have a very special program tonight with 4 scholars of the original John Muir Trail. So it's going to be a very interesting night. But first, a few basics here of Tuolumne Meadows that I would like to cover. Number 1 is here we are in the subalpine, right? And we have this beautiful river. Has anybody gotten the chance to maybe dip your feet in, or maybe do a cannonball, or anything like that in the Tuolumne River? It's a very nice feeling, right, to be up here on a hot day and get to go swimming. But of course, this water is actually going downstream to the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which is then being used by the city of San Francisco. So it's an important reminder that literally people are using this water that we see up here. And of course, all the non-people, like little birds and little plants and insects, are all using this water too, and they deserve it just as much as we do. So it's important to keep it clean up here and not do anything to contribute to the dirtiness of this river, because it's literally being drank by people we may know. Some of us in this crowd may live in San Francisco. We got some, there you go, San Francisco people, cool. And then another amazing thing about being up here in Tuolumne Meadows is, of course, the wildlife up here. Has anybody gotten a chance to see any wildlife? What have you seen?
Squirrels.
Squirrels. Gotta love seeing the squirrels. Any chipmunks?
Yes.
Nice. How about some bigger animals? Anybody seen any marmots? Oh yeah, gotta love seeing the marmots. Perched up on a rock. Classic. Another big animal we have up here is the black bear. Has anybody seen a black bear? Raise your hand. This trip? So the black bear is a beautiful animal up here. They spend most of their time walking around, eating little ants and other bugs, and maybe some berries, maybe some seeds every once in a while. But every once in a while, they wander in a place like this. And I actually heard there was one seen not too long ago in this area. And they wander around in a place like this and maybe get the scent of burgers or caramelized onions or candy that all of us people bring up here. So it's really important that we never let them get that food. And what's the way we do that here in the campground?
Bear lockers.
Bear lockers, right? Storing all your food, all your scented items in there, even your little chapstick and your sunscreen, putting that in the bear locker so that they never even have a chance to be exposed to it, right? Because we want them to keep eating their natural diet of little ants and little insects, not a giant 3-pound burger. As good as that is for us, or some of us. But so the black bears are an amazing creature up here, and they share this mountain home with us. So it's important that we respect their home while we're here. That's a little bit about the wildlife. Another thing I'll mention with the bears as well is of course, they do cross these roads, right? So we really need to drive the speed limits. There are some parts in the park where the speed limit drops down to like 25 miles per hour, and that's for a very intentional reason. So please go slow as you're driving through the mountains. The point isn't to rush through them, right? It's to slow down and enter the mountain time up here in Yosemite National Park. So here in Yosemite, we offer a variety of ranger programs, just like this one that you're at now. And after this, at 9:30, we have a wonderful star program, just right over at the Lambert Dome parking lot. It's about an hour-long program with an amazing ranger who knows an incredible amount about the stars. So if you're at all interested in that, it's at 9:30 at the Lambert Dome parking lot, right after this. And then tomorrow, we offer a handful of other programs as well. At 8:30 in the morning, we have a yoga program at the same location at the Lambert Dome parking lot. And then for all the youth in the crowd, I see a few younger folks. We have a junior ranger program tomorrow at 10 o'clock that meets at the campground office. So that little stone building on the side of the road right here when you leave the campground office. And then tomorrow night, we have another campfire program. This year right now, we're only doing 3 a week during the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So this is the time right now to be here to see one of these ranger-led campfire programs. And if you come tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, you may just see a familiar face. But we'll leave it at that, and I want to let the 4 scholars have begin their presentation. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. My name is Peter Hirst, and forgive me if I'm a little nervous. I'll relax as the night goes on. I've been wanting to do this for years. The trail we're going to talk about tonight was cut a little over 100 years ago through this alpine forest, through alpine meadows, and across a couple of 100 miles of solid granite in a vast land that had been occupied for thousands of years by our fellow human beings. And I'd like to call Inga up to read a few words acknowledging that prior history.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Inga.
I'm Inga Aksamit, and I'm really happy to be here. So before we get started with the program, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Awanichi, a branch of the southern Miwok, along with the Paiute, Mono, and other tribes that inhabit the Sierra. And I want to pay my respects to the elders who have lived here for 4,000 years at least, maybe as long as 8,000 years, up to the present. Over many generations, they're the ones that tramped the first trails across the Sierra. And there were 5 main lateral trails that we think they used for trading when they had their heavy loads and they went over to meet people from either side of the Sierra to do their trading. But of course, they traveled all over the Sierra. And there's signs of summer camps, arrowheads, and obsidian on all the different high basins and along crests everywhere. So we have them to thank for the trails that we hike today. Thank you.
Thanks, Inga. I'm going to say just a couple of words about how I got here and an overview of what you're going to hear about tonight. Then I'll turn it over to the 3 other speakers, and then I'll finish up a little bit at the end. I had, about 8 years ago, I had been hiking the John Muir Trail one end to the other for 50 years, and it was then 8 years ago that I decided that maybe I'd better fill in the 200 miles in between. So when I started my hike from this very spot, this campground up here, about a mile south of here, there's a sign that says John Muir Route. And it's the only sign on the trail that calls it a route rather than the John Muir Trail. And that kind of caught my attention. I found it very interesting and very unusual. And of course, I had 200 miles to think about what that could possibly mean. At the end of those 200 miles, I had a general idea that maybe the John Muir route, maybe the route the way John Muir would have done it if he had had anything to do with the trail, which he did not. That maybe the trail is more of a living, breathing, changing thing than it is one single track cut in the ground. And when I got back from my route, I found posted on social media a note by a young mother who was planning a John Muir Trail through hike for her family. And she had young children. She had a husband who had limited time to get back to work. She had limited time to get back to work. So she told us all about the adjustments she had made. She was entering here rather than there. She was taking some time off. She was getting back on the trail. And she called this plan her interpretation of the John Muir Trail. And a light went on. This is the word I'd been looking for. The John Muir Trail itself is an interpretation of travel through the wilderness. And what I've discovered over the last few years that hiking the John Muir Trail involves all of our own interpretation of the John Muir Trail. You will see a line on a map, but that line opens you up to many, many more possibilities of alternative routes and side trips, which is how it was discovered by the Euro-Americans who came here only 100 and 150 years ago. So what you're going to hear tonight is 4 different interpretations of the John Muir Trail from 4 different people who have hiked it and loved it as I have. Those interpreters are myself, Inga Aksamit, author of 3 books, 2 cookbooks, and a personal memoir of her trip on the John Muir Trail, and Elizabeth Wenk, who is the author of the definitive guide to the John Muir Trail and many, many more books, including the definitive work on the wildflowers of the Sierra. And then I will finish up. I will also like to thank the rest of the members. This is quite a large team that's doing this, and the first time I've ever hiked other than solo in a long time. I now have 10 people all together hiking with me. I got to recognize John Ladd, just so you can see him and recognize him in daylight. John, could you stand up for us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you see me on the trail, they kill.
And did I leave Doug out?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, man.
I'm fine. Good.
Oh, this is how this happened. I was up here last year realizing some things about the John Muir Trail, and I happened to mention it to Doug that I was thinking about doing it next year. Doug said, "Yeah, let's do it." So here we are. Doug is an architectural historian and has a very, very interesting view on how the trail came to be and what it means. Doug's daughter Giles is with us. Her husband Evan will be joining us later down the trail. We will also be joined later down. Brian Kimball from this guy's amazing. Brian Kimball from Mammoth is doing a through hike of the John Muir Trail as a tune-up to the real hike he's doing later this summer. And after the program tonight, you can ask him what that is. It's another 300-mile or so trail for which he's tuning up. Rick Moses sitting next to him, our Navcom's tech guru, who is also joining us at Woods Creek, a couple 100 miles or so, and then finishing up the trail from there. Someone whose name may be familiar to you, Nina Spellman, who's a notorious trail angel working with Senior Muir's Taco Hut, which is sort of a pop-up free taco stand that happens on the John Muir Trail. We've already got John, and I'd like to give special thanks to Valerie Stinson, without whom none of this would have happened. I'm serious about that. Valerie's support for this whole thing and for her tolerance and understanding of my driving need to do this is awe-inspiring. Thanks, Mickey. Have I left anybody out? Okay. So now I would like to introduce. Hey.
Not me.
I would like to introduce our surprise guest. Doug Harnsberger is an architectural historian who, among many, many other things, was the force behind the listing of the John Muir Hut, which is just about the halfway point of the John Muir Trail, finally on the National Register of Historic Places. Did I say that right? Good. And we are actually on this trip going to do some work at the hut under Doug's guidance. So, everybody, Doug Harnsberger.
Giles to my Dana White here to hold up some drawings that you can't see, obviously, from your seat, but there's a couple reasons I want to bring these drawings to everyone's attention. They have not been seen since 1915. And they're beautiful rendered drawings, in this case of Parsons Lodge. Does everybody know where Parsons Lodge is? It's right here in Tuolumne Meadows. And I encourage you to go by tomorrow to take a look at this marvelous structure. It's a National Historic Landmark, which means it's up in the top 1% of historic buildings in this country. So it's already recognized as being significant. But the reason that this is so interesting for me as an architectural historian is that the storyline, the evolution of the design of Parsons Lodge has been lost since 1915, and it's been sitting dormant in a file at UC Berkeley, waiting to be rediscovered. They've put a heading together about Parsons Lodge, so it's there online if you want to go find it. But there are 20 original drawings done by the architect. And so the first thing I want to explain is that the byline about Parsons Lodge is that Bernard Maybeck was the architect. Has anybody heard of Bernard Maybeck? He did the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, that big dome structure right by the bay. Maybeck is probably up in the top echelon of architects practicing at the turn of the century. And he did a lot of work. He was trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. So he's a big-name architect for the turn of the century in this country. But it wasn't Maybeck who designed this building, and that's a first bit of information that I want to relate. And tomorrow I'm going to be delivering copies of these 20 sheets of drawings that were produced by somebody that nobody knows. And that nobody person was Maybeck's partner. And he was a Sierra Clubber, a very active Sierra Club character. And of course, nobody can read this from 30 feet, but they're beautifully rendered drawings, all hand done in pencil on vellum. This guy had talent, and he worked hard to evolve the design of the Parsons Lodge. So without going too deep into that hole, I just wanted to flag the National Park Service and the Sierra Club that these drawings are now available, and I'm leaving copies tomorrow morning at the lodge for everyone who's interested to see the evolution of the design of Parsons Lodge. One of the most interesting things that I could point out, if I can get to the original drawing, the colored one. See how the flat roof is so low profile? That's not the way the first design came out. It was a 2-story Swiss chalet with a A-frame roof on it. Totally different design that Mark White came up with. But for reasons that only he knows, the design evolved into something very different. So let me summarize about Parsons Lodge, because I think this is a really interesting storyline, that in the design of the lodge, he worked with a structural engineer named Walter Huber, to put together a structural drawing here that introduced these diagonal struts into the design of the piers, the stone piers that you see today. So the structural engineer came up with a solution for how to keep the roof from collapsing. And the most interesting thing about his solution was that he introduced a center column, or posts, in the middle of the design for winter time, when the snow loads were going to be heaviest on the lodge. So this concept of putting these posts in place during winter is still the case. It's the only structure I'm aware of where this kind of innovative technique of shoring up the building to deal with the snow loads was in fact designed by Walter, and here we are 120 years later, almost, still doing the same thing that he came up with. These guys worked together hand in glove to come up with this very innovative solution, and it's still in use today. Probably the most interesting thing about that drawing that we looked at with a magnifying glass is that White came up with this term after they came up with the structural solution to put a notation over the mantelpiece, and that notation reads, "For a winter's snow and frost, brace your roof with pillar and post." That's a basic instruction. Summertime, you don't need it, but in the wintertime, brace it with pillar and post. Unfortunately, that didn't get stenciled over the mantle, and I'd like to see it happen. I think it's a great quote. It's a direction for how and when to put these posts in place. So that's enough about Parsons Lodge. I also want to introduce in my 3 minutes here the Muir shelter that was the focus of my study back in 2014. This is another drawing that was hidden for 100 and some years. It's produced by a guy named Gutterson. It's so interesting that we've got these landmark buildings on the John Muir Trail that were produced by architects that nobody's heard about. The drawings and their record just didn't survive. This drawing was folded up. It's a blueprint in a guy named William Colby's file. Colby was the secretary of the Sierra Club for 50 years, and he loved and admired John Muir. So this hut is a statement to honor John Muir. It's a temple to the spirit of John Muir in the High Sierra. And the reason it has this steep stone roof and it looks like a little temple is that at a critical moment in the thought process, it was decided that that was the form that the Sierra Club wanted to build to honor Muir. And another little interesting storyline is that, coincidentally, the National Geographic had published a large article about the Trulli huts in southern Italy that are all based on this very steep stone design. So we have a hut here at 12,000 feet on the John Muir Trail that is derivative of these Trulli huts in southern Italy from the 14th century. But it's been modified again to survive at 12,000 feet with some very clever engineering. So again, there was some sophisticated architecture, design, and structural engineering going on in these huts built along the John Muir Trail. And Parsons Lodge and the Muir Shelter, another beautiful rendering by this guy Gutterson. He had a wonderful hand. That too was a drawing that was in the file of William Colby's. So what I find so fascinating is that we walk up to these buildings and they have these unusual details that aren't understood, how they came about. That the storyline is that the Sierra Club, led by William Colby, and wanting to honor Muir, and in this case to honor the effort that Muir made to preserve the parks and to safeguard these places for all of us, to establish the national park service. All these things were brought together in building these two structures, and the storyline behind their design has been forgotten. So I find it terribly exciting to bring this information forward and to leave it at Parsons Lodge tomorrow so that anyone who's interested can page through all these drawings and understand how the buildings evolved. So I think I've used up my time, so I'll let somebody else talk for a few minutes.
Thanks, Doug. Next, I want to introduce Inga again. Inga Aksamit is a well-known personality as a curator in her own right, the administrator of the John Muir Trail Facebook page, author of 2 cookbooks, The Hungry Spork and The Hungry Spork Trail Recipes, and highs and lows on the John Muir Trail, her own saga of discovery, personal and otherwise, of the John Muir Trail. So we've heard about Parsons Lodge, which later in the evening you'll come to realize is very, very important. It is sort of to me, it's the spiritual home of the John Muir Trail, and it is my sentimental favorite as the true trailhead of the John Muir Trail. And we'll get into a little bit more of the story behind the building later. But right now, let's bring on Inga Aksamit to talk about the people involved behind discoveries of the John Muir Trail. Thanks.
Hi again. So I'm going to be talking about women of the early trails. So we hear a lot about...
Can I ask you to speak louder?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have a little soft voice, so I'll do my best. So we hear a lot about many of the men. There's many features named after them. They were widely publicized. And we don't hear as much about the women. So I'd like to start by talking about several women. The first is Maria Lebrado. She was an American Indian And her name was really Totuya, which means foaming water, of which we have a lot of foaming water in Yosemite, don't we? And she was the granddaughter of Tenaya, the chief of the Yosemite tribe. And she was notable because when she died in 1931, at the age of 90, she was the last full-blooded member of her tribe. And after her death, I like this quote from Mrs. H.J. Taylor, who wrote about her, tying back to her name of foaming water. The quote is, "She will be heard as long as the melting snows pour in torrents over the granite walls of her childhood Yosemite." The next person I'd like to talk about is Maggie Howard. We're in Tuolumne Meadows, so Maria was born in Yosemite Valley, and Maggie Howard was born at Mono Lake, over on the east side. Although she did live most of her life in Yosemite Valley, she was a member of the Paiute tribe. She was one of the first American Indian women to do cultural demonstrations, and she worked at the Yosemite Museum from 1929 to 1942, demonstrating grinding the acorn and the acorn preparation that was so important to their food, and basket weaving. And then she was succeeded by additional cultural demonstrators, and we currently have Julia Parker, who's been with the park for 50 years and is currently still doing presentations. So if you have any interest in learning more, I encourage you to visit the Indian Village down in Yosemite Valley, and maybe even sign up for one of Julia Parker's basket weaving programs. There's a 3-day program being held this year at the end of September, and those are offered through the Yosemite Conservancy. So I'd like to also talk about some of the early female climbers and hikers. So Helen Marion Gompertz was a woman who was an accomplished climber. She came to Yosemite often with her friends. She became a charter member of the Sierra Club when it was established in 1892. So even way back then, we had lots of women who were up here in the mountains climbing and hiking. At the same time, Little Joe LeConte is a very well-known name across the Sierra. He was a familiar name in climbing circles, as was his father, also named Joe. The elder Joe was well-known in the Sierra Club, and as a geologist, confirmed John Muir's theory of the glacial origin of Yosemite Valley. Little Joe had many climbing companions of his own, but more and more, he and Helen were climbing together, and eventually they got married in 1901. Little Joe was the second Sierra Club president after Muir, and undoubtedly was supported in this effort by his wife and climbing partner. So if you're hiking the John Muir Trail and you pass through LeConte Canyon, maybe you'll remember Joe and Helen and the elder Joe as you pass through that canyon, which was named for Little Joe. Lucy Brown is one of the few women to have a pass named for her. If you were at the program last night, we learned that peaks and passes tend to be named after men if they are named after people, whereas lakes tend to be named for women. So Wanda Lake is an example. Wanda was one of John Muir's daughters. But Lucy has a pass named after her. It's called Lucy's Foot Pass. It's a Class 2 pass that was first crossed by Lucy Brown and her husband in 1896 during an exploration of the King's Kern Divide. According to Sacor's classic climbing guide, the High Sierra Peaks, Passes, and Trails, it's characterized by difficult talus on the north side. And if you've read any of Sacor's descriptions, you know that that's about as flowery and descriptive as it gets. Her husband was Bolton Coit Brown, a professor at Stanford and a Sierra Club member. The Boltons contributed sketches and maps that enhanced the understanding of the King's Kern Divide. And in 1899, they were joined by their 2-year-old daughter. And so I love this quote from Bolton about his daughter. "We put her on a burro, and whither we went, she went also." And I think that's a great role model for adventurous parents. And I see we have some babies here and some small kids. All right, so Marjorie Bridge was a professional photographer. And so it was unusual at the time for women to have their own business, but she had her own photography studio in San Francisco. And she was friends with Ansel Adams. And she was notable because she was among the first to practice technical climbing in the Sierra. So modern European rock climbing techniques were brought to the Sierra by Robert Underhill through his involvement in the Appalachian Mountain Club. He was invited to go on a high Sierra outing by Francis Farquhar, who was a prominent member of the Sierra Club. And while Underhill was here, he conducted master climbing classes with small groups of climbers. And Marjorie was in that first group who learned rope techniques and belaying techniques. And so in 1934, Marjorie Bridge climbed the higher cathedral spire, the first woman to do so and one of the first people to do so. And in 1935, she married Francis Farquhar, and so they made quite a couple here in the Sierra. She made a name for herself as a skilled rock climber and pioneered new technical climbs across the Sierra, and was the first woman to ascend the difficult east face of Mount Whitney, which is, of course, the highest peak in the continental United States. In 1929 through the 1960s, she led Sierra Club high trips, introducing people to the beauty of the Sierra, and served on the board of the Sierra Club. She only died in 1999, so that was not really all that long ago. So I like to think that I follow in her footsteps since I'm a Sierra Club backpacker. So I'd like to end with Marion Randall Parsons. She was an accomplished mountaineer, climbing more than 50 major peaks across the western United States, Canada, and the Canadian Rockies. She was also involved in supporting the establishment of the National Park System through her work in the Sierra Club. And it was in 1902 when she was introduced to the Sierra Club by Wanda Muir. They were both in their early 20s, and they were in Berkeley together. And she was invited to come to a Sierra Club outing, the high country outings, only the third one that had ever been held. And she met Edward Taylor Parsons of the Parsons Lodge fame and additional fame. So by 1907, she was married to him, and unfortunately, they were only married for about 7 years because he tragically died very early, just a few months before John Muir died. So she, after he died, she was elected to the board of directors of the Sierra Club, the first woman to do so, and she served for 22 years. So I like to think that Marion may have influenced some of the changes in the Sierra Club dress code. So from the very first outing, there was an announcement: skirts can be short. And what they mean by short, not more than halfway from the knee to the ankle, and bloomers can be worn underneath. So in 1914, they made a radical change and said that knickerbockers could be worn under the skirts. And in 1920, they said that trousers were an option.
Wow.
I can tell you that nowadays we don't have a dress code. Marion was a prolific writer. She wrote many articles about her trips and climbs and California history, book reviews, and she even published a few novels. She was close to Muir and edited his book called Travels in Alaska after his death so that it could be brought to print. I'd like to close with a quote from Marion in one of her writings. She was writing of a much later outing, 60 years later, and William Colby, who was the one who started the outings, this was his last outing. So I like to, I think that her quote reflects how I often feel when I come back to the mountains, and maybe it's how you feel, and especially last night I heard about all these families who come to Tuolumne Meadows every year. So Marion wrote, "The stay in Tuolumne Meadows, made so familiar and dear by many a former trip, that to tread its campgrounds and drink from its soda spring, to watch its red dawns and purpling evenings, moved one with something like the feeling of an exile returning home. So thank you very much. And at this point, I'd like to introduce my friend, Lizzie Wenk. Any of you who are hiking the John Muir Trail probably have her classic guidebook about hiking the John Muir Trail, okay? She also has a wildflower book, so any naturalist would be well advised to have her book. I keep it on my Kindle so that I can look at it when I'm hiking, and I can blow up the pictures and make sure I'm looking at the right thing. She's also been madly revising many of the guidebooks and had the Sierra North and Sierra South that came out. She has a book on hiking Mount Whitney, and we're anxiously awaiting the vastly updated hiking guide to Yosemite, which has all the hiking trails of Yosemite, which will be due out later this year. And I can tell you that Lizzie's maps are unsurpassed and greatly enhance hiking trail. So Lizzie, come on up and tell us about your early work.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. So I'm going to talk about sort of the evolution of the J&T and my efforts to map that, just very briefly, since this could take hours. So, as Inga said, I've written lots of books. I've hiked nearly every trail in the Sierra, always with a keen eye for the natural history. But about a year ago, a National Park Service historian in D.C. contacted me and asked me to help him interpret some historic maps and documents to plot out where the historic trails had gone. And this was just a treasure trove of fun for me. Now, I want to step back. When Inga first started, she gave an acknowledgement of country. And I split each year between Australia and the United States. And every public gathering in Australia begins with an acknowledgement of country to acknowledge the Aboriginal people, the indigenous custodians of the land. And I think that's a really important way to start, to say that what we're walking on today are the trails of today's population, but there were trails there before and many successive layers of trails. And we always need to remember back that we aren't the only people to love this land. And as Inga also said, the American Indians would have been everywhere in the Sierra. There's arrowheads, camps, wherever you would look. So we know they were everywhere. We know there were many major trade routes that went mostly east-west across the Sierra. When you're up near the crest, they tend to follow the drainages. That's the easiest country. So they would have gone from Mono Pass along the forks of the Tuolumne and down over Kearsarge Pass, down Bubbs Creek, down Paiute Creek, which is out of Bishop. And then you get to a point in the elevation where the rivers become very in size. I imagine many people here have been to Cedar Grove, wonderful flat valley in Kings Canyon. But then all of a sudden, to get there, you have to take a very circuitous route up mountain roads because the river becomes incredibly incised and it would no longer be followable. So at that elevation, here it was just in western Tuolumne Meadows. Suddenly, instead of following a river, the American Indian trails followed the ridges. It followed the Mariposa, so the Merced-Tuolumne drainage divide westward. Similarly, instead of continuing down the Kings drainage beyond Cedar Grove, it climbed up on the ridge to the south and followed the Kings Kaweah divide, where you had wonderful rolling terrain. So these were the first best-known trails of the Sierra. But the American Indians had been very light on the trails. And when the shepherds then arrived, they completely discounted that there was already a network of trails there. And certainly within a couple years, their sheep would have overprinted everything. Maybe they were being willfully ignorant. Maybe they weren't being observant. But certainly the first generation of trails vanished and the shepherd trails appeared. No sooner did what I'll call the white explorers show up than they discounted all the shepherd's trails. They had no interest in whatever pre-existing knowledge was there. They decided they were out scouting for themselves. And we'll never know if they were willfully ignorant, but certainly there would have been another generation of trails they followed. And they were very similar to those that the American Indians had made because they had to be. None of these groups built trails. They found trails. They looked at the landscape and looked for natural breaks. Where could you walk? Where could you follow that drainage? Where could you not follow the drainage? Where was there a notch with trees that indicated you could cross a pass? And so this was the framework. This was what existed when those first white explorers showed up. And quite early, there were a number of people, little Joe LeConte, the younger Joe LeConte, Theodore Solomons, William Colby, these names we've already heard tonight, who all were out busily exploring the Sierra, trying to push further and further and see different pieces. Theodore Solomons is usually credited with the idea of a crest parallel route from the Yosemite area to Mount Whitney, so the precursor of the John Muir Trail. William Colby actually had very similar ideas. So they each would go out every summer exploring. And when you read these historic documents, you realize that some of them were incredibly capable explorers. Whenever I read an article that the younger Joe LeConte wrote for the Sierra Club Bulletin, and he describes, 3 notches to the north of such and such a peak, even though none of this had names, I can sit there, I can look in Google Earth, I can remember for myself when I was there, and he inevitably picked the best route across the landscape. He clearly really could read the landscape. Now, maybe he was following the Shepherd's Trail, maybe he was following American Indian Trail, but he certainly knew how to read the landscape. Theodore Solomons, not so much. I don't know if anyone's read any of his adventures, but he was very haphazard in his travels. He got caught in snowstorms, his cameras fell off his mules. Everything seemed to go wrong for Theodore Solomons. But what struck me more when I started taking these stories and trying to draw them on a modern map was that Theodore Solomons would get somewhere and he'd write, I had looked at a wall. There was no way across it. I spent 5 days walking up and down, looking at every lake, and there was no way across it. And I'm thinking, didn't you see that band of trees that went straight across where there's a natural pass? And, and you look at the old Shepherd's map, oh, there was a natural pass that went across there. So Solomons did a lot of exploring, but not very efficiently. I really have to wonder if the little bits and pieces he was the first to push through was almost by chance, that he happened to get lucky sometimes because he had a lot of dead ends. So what I did is I took all these Sierra Club bulletins, I took historic maps, and I sat there with our modern map-making tools, Google Earth, various GIS programs, and approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, I started plotting out where these people had likely walked. And then comparing it to where the John Muir Trail goes today, trying to figure out who, at least among the white explorers, who was the first to walk those pieces of ground. And this sort of all came together when McClure was asked, when the idea of the John Muir Trail was funded by the California State Legislature, and McClure was asked to map it, to draw where the map would go. And he obviously was familiar with everyone else's travels and talked to them. There was communications back and forth with him and William Colby, with him and Joe LeConte. And he started drawing lines across the newly published 30-minute USGS topo maps. This was in 1915 to designate where the John Muir Trail would go. And remarkably, most of it is actually what is still the designated trail. There are lots of bits and pieces that have changed, lots of bits that took decades to come into existence, but that group of people, men, mostly men, few women, actually, by that point, knew the Sierra well enough that they knew where the natural trails existed. So I want to step back to this again. So the American Indians, the Shepherds didn't build trails. Shepherds built a few bridges, but other than that, they took what nature gave them. Then, of course, by the early 1900s, we had dynamite. We could have built a trail just about anywhere we wanted. But there was amazingly this philosophy among those Sierra Club members, that you used the trails that existed. You would, if you had to blast, you blasted a little. But more or less, you wanted to find a natural route. So this line, the McClure drew on the map, as much as possible followed natural breaks in the landscape. They saw where there was a band of trees that crossed an otherwise steep rock face that told you that would be a path across. They saw where there was a wide river valley you could follow, where there was a ramp you might be able to take from one valley up to a higher one. And it was really amazing to plot their journeys out and then step back, zoom out effectively in Google Maps, and just see how amazingly well they had picked a route across the landscape. And since it's hard to go into details without a map, to show all of you, I'm not going to, but if anyone who's familiar with the John Muir Trail wants to come and talk afterwards, I'd be happy to talk about the little pieces that did change and those that stayed much more constant across time. Oh, okay, I didn't know this. So I'm now introducing Peter Hirst again, who, well, is a moderator of the John Muir Trail Route Facebook group, because ever since, as he said 8 years ago, he really liked this idea of the John Muir Trail being not just one trail, but instead a route across the landscape. And I don't actually know what you're summarizing, so I'm going to just let you stand up.
Thank you. That was the setup. I just wanted to hear Elizabeth Wenk say my name.
Oh, is that what it was?
That's what it was. So I came to this, and I'm going to try to tie all of this together, because I know we've had, what does the Parsons Lodge have to do with the John Muir Trail? And what do these people have to do with the John Muir Trail more specifically? So I'm going to try to wrap this all together. And Lizzie, I couldn't have had a better introduction than what you said about how they looked at the trail. Let me start with how I looked at the trail. In 1964, I was taken on my first trip to the other end of the John Muir Trail. It lasted 2 days because we got snowed out in the middle of August. And it took me 50 years of hiking here and there and around about. Finally, I came back, and I really started looking at the trail and where it was. And it struck me as very odd, because as Lizzie mentioned, it was supposed to be a crest parallel trail as high as practicable to connect the Yosemite area with the Whitney area, pretty much along the crest in the high country. Well, who has seen a map of the John Muir Trail from beginning to end? What struck me about it is that the beginning of it starts down in Happy Isles at 4,000 feet. It comes up here to 8,000 feet, and then it goes south. And it struck, why was that? And I concluded very cynically, well, that first 20 miles starts in the wrong place. It's too low an elevation. It's too far from the crest, and it's going in the wrong direction. Why is that? That got me very curious about how the John Muir Trail came to be. For me, the beginning of that story is really 1894, when William Colby, who we've heard of before, and his buddy Leon Solomons, Theodore's little brother, and Ernest Bonner, later hiking companion of Theodore Solomons, all Berkeley students from rising sophomore to Leon Solomons, a graduate student. By the way, I can't resist. Any psychology students among us? Any psychology majors or practicing psychologists? Okay, never mind. Leon Solomons, among other things, was the co-author of Gertrude Stein's first book when they were research partner at Johns Hopkins University. So Leon Solomons went on to great things. Died very, very young, but was an up-and-coming genius psychologist. His brother Theodore was something of an adventurer, and as Lizzie intimated, as an explorer, not so much, but he did contribute a couple of very important things. So in 1894, Solomons the Younger, Colby, and Bonner get together, and they set out from Tahoe with the specific intention of hiking all the way from Tahoe to Whitney in a single summer. Guess how far they got? right here, the Soda Springs. They squatted on John Lembert's property at the Soda Springs, of the remains of which there is a little bit today. That exclosure around the Soda Spring itself is a remnant of Lembert's property over there. They met Lembert. They made friends with him. He finally welcomed them to spend the rest of the summer on their property. And Colby, among other things, took a trip down to Glen Allen, down the Tuolumne River, up Cold Creek, Cold Peak, Virginia Lake, up there. Never told anybody about it for 35 years. That summer they met Theodore Solomons because Colby and Solomons the younger and Bonner had actually helped blaze the trail from Tuolumne all the way down from Tuolumne Meadows all the way down the river to what was then Hetch Hetchy Valley. Solomons met them in Hetch Hetchy Valley and no doubt learned of the original intent of their plan to hike the whole way down to Mount Whitney. The following year, Solomons came back and took the first of his somewhat inconclusive forays toward a north to south trail. He got about as far as the Four Gables, just short of Selden Pass. If you know the trail, you'll know that that's not very far, and he got there without crossing any of the major mountain passes except Donahue. But he published it the next year in the Sierra Club Bulletin as an exploration for what was then called the High Mountain Route, that high crest parallel trail that was going to connect Yosemite with the Whitney area. The following summer, 1895, he got a little bit farther. He got to the base of Evolution Creek when the story goes that Solomon's told the way he stumbled into Evolution Valley was one of the sheep herders said, no, don't go up the main fork of the river, go up here, it's much prettier. And lo and behold, it was. So they dropped most of their kit at the bottom of Evolution Creek, climbed up Evolution Creek into Evolution Valley. They got within sight of Muir Pass, but instead of crossing it to continue the journey southward to their goal, they decided to bag a couple of pieces. They bagged Fisk, and they made an attempt at Darwin, which failed short of the peak, retreated back down to Evolution Valley, went back up Goddard Canyon to Mount Goddard, got caught in a snowstorm, which seemed to have been Theodore Solomon's favorite thing to do, and then retreated, just as Lizzie suggested, in fact, by accident, down the south side of that and out the middle fork of the river. 40 years later, Solomons published his story of that and said, I pioneered the high mountain route. And as Lizzie said, maybe not so much. Fast forward to 1908, when Little Joe LeConte was at the culmination of about 20 years of truly diligent exploration, exploring up the Mono recesses, down through Fish Creek, through one of the sections of the original John Muir Trail that I don't believe has been hiked since, and we'll be doing next week. He really worked at finding those natural passages across the high mountain route. And finally, in 1908, he made a pretty good semblance of the trip from here to Kings Canyon. Fast forward again to 1914. This is when things really get interesting. Colby had been leading the Sierra Club high trips every single year since 1901 through 1914. And there was a progression, there was a method to his madness. His goal was to establish a permanent summer camp up here at the Soda Springs. And in 1914, he almost succeeded. And a lot happened in that year. They're sitting around the campfire over at the Soda Springs, and a guy named Meyer Lissner, who happened to be a very close advisor of the governor at the time, said, you know what, I'll bet we could raise some money to improve the trails around here. What does everybody think of that? And they said, the club as a whole said, let's do it. So while they were formulating exactly how much money they wanted to raise, what trails they wanted to spend on it, they went to John Muir and they said, John, what do you think of that? Muir said, that's a great idea. Let's build a trail from Tuolumne to Hetch Hetchy, last-ditch effort to save Hetch Hetchy from the water developers. Then two very important things happened. Edward Parsons died. And as Doug has said, that was the inspiration for building a memorial lodge at the spot, not only where the high mountain route or where the trail building project started, but years before, on that very start, is where John Muir had a very important discussion with some very important people to form the Yosemite National Park. So not only was the idea of the John Muir Trail born in Tuolumne, but the very idea of Yosemite National Park was born right over there at the Soda Springs, approximately on the site where try to read while looking into a fire. Approximately at the point where, at the place where Parsons Lodge is now, and John Lembert's cabin had been in 1894. Then another very important event happened. The end of 1914, Christmas Eve, in fact, John Muir died. And it was that point at which Colby said, I know what trail to build, I know who to name it after, and I know how to sell it to the state legislature and get money for it. That's when he went to work to raise the money to build what would become the John Muir Trail. At the same time, however, I don't think there's anybody here who was here last week to hear Yin and Chan's discussion of the history of the Tioga Road. But that sort of begins in 1914, where Wilbur McClure, who's been mentioned earlier, the state engineer, was assigned to complete Highway 120 up the canyon from Lee Vining to the west entrance of the park, which at the time he was assigned connected with no road, and to complete the Oakdale Road from Groveland essentially to the entrance at Big Oak Flat. During this period, McClure met Mather because Mather was promoting access to the park. Please complete the highways to these entrances to the park. So Mather knew McClure by the end of 1914 when Mather got assigned to take over the whole national park program by the Secretary of the Interior. So when, at the same time that Muir died and Colby went to work on getting a trail built and naming it after Muir, Mather was busy actually buying the Tioga Road to connect those two new entrances with a road that would belong to the park. At the time, it was an old, rundown, abandoned wagon track to a failed mining district over on the east side. So Mather is working on developing and bringing access to the park. He personally bought the Tioga Road and gave it to the U.S. government. Guess who the lawyer was who papered that transaction for him, got an act of Congress passed, and allowed it to happen? William Colby, who was working on behalf of the Sierra Club and on behalf of Stephen Mather. 1915, Mather gets formally appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Interior to take over the national parks. Oops, now we have someone who's personally buying the road and trying to donate it to the government. William Colby actually forms a trust, takes the Tioga Road in trust, and conveys it himself to the U.S. government. Also in 1915, Mather is forming the Desmond Park Company to compete with the Curry Company under his new idea of how to get the parks developed through government franchises. 1915 was also the year of the famous Mather Mountain Party, in which Mather got together all the influential people in the country he could possibly muster and took them on a high trip of his own for 2 weeks from Sierra National Forest east to climb Mount Whitney. At the end of that trip, they descended Mount Whitney, rented a couple of big Packard touring cars in Lone Pine, paraded up 395, then known as the Camino Sierra, to dedicate the new Tioga Road that Mather had just donated to the park at Tioga Pass. After that, they came down here to the Soda Springs, which was by then owned by the Sierra Club, and partied for a couple of days to celebrate it. The legislation authorizing the John Muir Trail had been passed on May 5th. On June 4th, there was a meeting in a room at the Sierra Club headquarters in San Francisco, and there were 5 people in the room where it happened. There was William McClure, the state engineer, assigned with deciding, not just mapping, but deciding where the trail would go. William Colby, then the very influential secretary and lawyer for the Sierra Club, Walter Huber, whose name we've heard before in connection as the engineer of the Parsons Lodge, the supervisor of the Sierra National Forest and the supervisor of the Sequoia National Forest. Who was not represented in this meeting? Yosemite National Park had no presence in the meeting, even though the trail was to start there. My thesis, what I've discovered, is that McClure was probably representing Mather and therefore representing the national parks. Since, remember, I mentioned the Desmond Company, which was going to develop hotels in the valley to compete with Curry, and you heard the description. Lizzie, did you read the description of where the trail was to start?
I didn't. I left the specifics out.
Okay. The specifics were the trail was now to start not in Tuolumne, which was the spiritual home of the Sierra Club that Colby had been building for 15 years through the High Club. The trail was now to start on the north side of the valley, near either Yosemite Village or Mirror Lake. At this time, it was not quite clear. Not at Happy Isles, not at Tuolumne Meadows, the home of the Sierra Club that Colby had been building, but on the north side, property now controlled by the Mather's new Desmond Company. And that explains to me why the first 20 miles of the John Muir Trail started not up here where it is logical. It's near the crest, it's high, it's a straight line from here to Whitney, but down below in the valley, which is actually closer to Mount Whitney than we are right now. Mather wanted a presence such as the John Muir Trail in his new development of Yosemite Village on the north side of the valley. So Brian over here and I just hiked that trail a couple of days ago, and believe me, if this trail was designed to bring people into the park to love the wilderness, it's the wrong way to do it. It's a 2,500-foot climb in a mile and 7/10. McClure's own engineering spec for the John Muir Trail was a 10% grade with an occasional maximum of 15%. The first 2 miles of the John Muir Trail, as it was originally conceived, averaged almost a 30% grade. Mather was up to something. McClure was in on it with him. And so they built it right down there so that it was sort of in view of Curry Village, but inaccessible to them. After that, the original route up from Mirror Lake faded. By 1934, when Pete Starr wrote his first guide, he said, let's move the trail over to Happy Isles. In fact, in reviewing that book, the first guide to the John Muir Trail in 1935, little Joe LeConte said, all these trails come together, all these alternative trails come together at Tuolumne Meadows, the start of the John Muir Trail. So in the Sierra Club heart, I believe, the trail starts right here. 1943, the revision of Starr's guide made an attempt to put the trailhead at the LeConte Lodge, now the Yosemite Conservation Heritage Center, but that only lasted a couple of years and it disappeared as fast as it appeared. The first actual trail guide, published by under the auspices of the park in 1953, again put the trailhead here in Tuolumne. So I feel very confident in my sentimental choice for the true home of the John Muir Trail to be right here in Tuolumne. Now, Lizzie mentioned that it deviates in places from the present trail, and it does, but all those little sections add up to almost 90 miles. That's over a third of the trail as it is hiked today is different in some way from the original John Muir Trail. And this developed over the years. The high trail was moved back to Thousand Island. The Fish Creek descent was moved up to the higher lakes. The original trail straight across Vermilion Lake was moved up, Vermilion Valley was moved up out of the valley even before the lake was there. So all of these different trails that Lizzie has meticulously mapped into a gorgeous track that we're setting out to follow tomorrow, developed over years and years. And when I was hiking up here last year, using Pete Starr's guide to all the different alternative trails, it dawned on me. I said, you know, the trail developed over all these years. Parts of it weren't even built until years after other parts of it had moved. And I did a little research, and I put together a little logical progression on this. And I did a little background research, read everything I could on every supposed through hike of the John Muir Trail that the Sierra Club undertook. And I'm announcing right now to you for the first time publicly. I've been bragging about it privately and very excitedly for several weeks now. But the trip we start on or re-embark on tomorrow, as far as we can tell, will be the first time that original route has ever been through hiked. There was just too much of it that was never built. We'll be going up an approach to Whitney on which there is no trail. We'll be going over Junction Pass on a route that's been abandoned for 85 years. We'll be taking a diagonal dive down into Fish Valley that hasn't been done, I believe, since Little Joe LeConte did it in 1908 and no trail was ever built. So there are any number of changes in the route that make it extraordinarily unlikely that anybody has ever done the original route, if for no other reason they didn't have Elizabeth Wenk doing the map making. So this gets back to my idea of interpretation of the trail. This is our interpretation of the trail. This is our interpretation, our response, an expression of gratitude, really, to the early explorers of the John Muir Trail, Little Joe LeConte and William Colby in particular. But Randall Taylor chronicled all of this. She was probably the most prolific writer of reporter of the summer high trips, especially this 1929 trip that was already alluded to as Colby's last. And she specifically wrote of the last day of that hike, which was Colby's actual first long trip on the John Muir Trail. Started down at Florence Lake, just about the halfway route, came all the way up here, and she very specifically describes this wonderful last day, hiking from Glen Aulin, Cold Creek, remember I mentioned that? Cold Mountain, Virginia Lake, that trip that Colby had taken in 1894 that he had never told anybody about. He saved it for 35 years, kept it secret, and gave it as his parting gift to the 200 people who went with him on that last day, on his last trip as leader of the high trips, and ended his first and longest John Muir trip over here at Parsons Lodge. So, as you're hiking the John Muir Trail, let go of the idea that it's a single artifact, that it's a single physical track in the ground. It's all of these things, all of these explorations to understand, as Lizzie said, the true natural path across the mountains. And of course, that true natural path is different for each of us, and can be your interpretation of the John Muir Trail. So with that, I'd like to leave you with the thoughts of that great Sierran poet T.S. Eliot, who said, "We shall never cease from exploring, and the end of all our exploration will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Thank you.